Everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus coming at you with the top decks of the modern format going into November 2023. Starting with the elephant in the room, Rakdos Scam. Now, Rakdos Scam, Rakdos Evoke, whatever term you wish to call it, whether you want it to be PC or non-PC, that's up to you. Scam is the same stuff that it's been since the printing of Orcish Bowmaster. Evoke powerful elementals on turn 1, or Ragavan your opponent, follow it up with some decent mid-range threats. Try to close out the game before your opponent can get back into the game. To beat it, you've basically got to be able to weather the storm, answer their threat or two that got the ball rolling, and then have to out-top deck them from there. There's been a couple of decks that have adapted to kind of beating up on, or at least having a decent game against Scam. Those include the new Omnath Bean deck that we'll get to in a minute, but also such old standbys as Rhinos variants and mono black coffers, as well as mono green or Harden Scales all seem to have pretty reasonable matchups overall. Murktide has a close-ish matchup, and that is pretty much the decks according to both what I've observed playing some Rakdos Scam as well as Frank Karsten's article up on the Magic Mothership. This deck's approaching 20% of the 20 to 30% of the winner's meta. Something's got to be done soon, one way or another. Either people have to shy away from the deck because they get tired of playing mirror matches, or something needs to happen to put this deck to bed. It still has a north of 50% winning percentage, despite the fact it's over almost 20% of the meta. Despite the fact that everybody's gunning for it and knows it's a known quantity. People thought it was going to get banned in the last round of bans, but since it's the middle of RCQ season, unfortunately, it probably bought itself another month or two until whatever the RCQ season is done. But that is the top deck. Let's start talking about some of the decks that fill in around it, shall we? The aforementioned Omnath Bean. Now, I'm not 100% sure who is the originator of this deck idea. I know Aspiring Spike is certainly the person that iterated on it the most. This deck is powerful, but a little overhyped. It has a reasonable Rakdos Evoke matchup. It's still close to 50-50. But basically, this is your old Omnath deck with replacing the One Ring and Run in 6 with some Cascade spells like Shardless Agent or Bloodbraid Elf. Some variants choose Ardent Plea. Basically, you cascade into, you set up your deck so you can cascade into Up the Beanstalk. This makes all of your Evoke Elementals draw cards, so even if you're evoking them, you're drawing cards. And then you get to play the rest of the cast, Furies, Solitudes, Leyline Bindings, Omnath, sometimes Teferi, Time Raveler, both to kind of stifle the mirror match from cascading into Bean, as well as the Cascade matchups. Nothing really new other than the fact that sometimes to Bean, sometimes not to Bean. There are some variants of the deck that forego Bean, or play Bean normally, along with Run in 6 and the One Ring. Myriad of different builds, much like when there was a split between Omnath Control and Omnath Elementals. There are a couple different ways to build the deck, but the main one that's seen a lot of play is these new Cascade variants into it. And then you basically do nothing for the first couple of turns other than maybe evoke an elemental, cast a Fire Ice or a Dead Gone, buy yourself some time, and then try to take over the mid game. This gives fits to Rakdos Scam because, well, it kind of answers most of their threats fairly easily, with Solitudes or Leyline Bindings or Teferis being able to answer basically everything in their deck. There's a little bit of back and forth, but definitely the later the game goes, the more it favors Omnath. Now, this deck is not unbeatable. It still has a lot of the same matchup problems it previously had. It still struggles against fast or linear decks like, sometimes Living End, struggles with cards or decks like Burn, struggles with decks like Tron and Creativity. So, while the makeup of the deck has changed a little bit, maybe it's a little bit more powerful, still remains a large portion of what it does. It has not changed all that much. Another deck you can easily see in the top 5 of the current format is Harden Scales. Now, Harden Scales doesn't have the raw numbers in terms of people that are playing it, because it is a little bit of a difficult deck to pick up, and in some ways has a lot of the different play lines like a deck like Amulet Titan has without as much exposure. But here's the numbers from Frank Carson's article. 58.66 win percentage against the field, and an almost 70% win percentage against Rakdos Evoke Scam, with an almost 70 match sample size. So this deck, while it is only about 4% of the winner's meta right now, is far and away the best results. Now, certainly there are cards that can target it, Force of Vigor, Pithing Needle, basically all your artifact, hate cards, shut down the things. One huge addition this deck got was Agatha's Soul Cauldron. Much like another deck on this list, Soul Cauldron fits very nicely into what this deck is trying to do with throwing around +1/+1 counters, with activated abilities like Walking Blister, Hangerback Walker, as well as Arcbound Ravager. Really took a deck to another level. And once again, surprise, surprise, one of the people iterating on it was Aspiring Spike in the early weekends of the new format. So it's kind of funny. A lot of people thought Ixalan was going to be kind of a dud when it came to Modern Power, but it did introduce 2 new 2-drops to the format that have really kind of shook things up a little bit. And actually, added Not Dead After All as well to evoke, like they needed another card. But Harden Scales is certainly a deck with a little less information on it out there, but it is somewhere between the old Affinity style decks and kind of this like combo kill you deck. It has the Walking Ballista that can, ping you out of nowhere for a bunch of damage. It has the Ink Moth Nexus that can ping you out of nowhere. So it kind of has that angle of attack that Hammer has, but is a lot more tricky, and people aren't as familiar with working around it as they are Hammer. That's why it's one of the top 5 decks, probably number 2 or number 3 currently in the format. Speaking of decks that were bolstered by Agatha's Soul Cauldron, Yawgmoth. Now, Yawgmoth was already a deck that certain members of the Channel Fireball team were very high on, namely Reed Duke, going into the Pro Tour. And that was despite a format that was going to be very full of decks like Rakdos Evoke, which are a terrible matchup for, or not a terrible, but not a great matchup for Golgari Yawgmoth. However, the addition of Agatha's Soul Cauldron, once again, kind of plays very nicely with what the deck does. Filling the graveyard with Grist, the Undying creatures, sacrificing things with Yawgmoth. The new Walking Ballista combo, which is another one of the Undying nonsense things you can do. Basically, you remove the counter, shoot your opponent, sack it with Yawgmoth, get it back with a +1/+1 counter, shoot your opponent. It's kind of like a smaller scale version of Geralf's Messenger when that was part of the deck. But Yawgmoth, powerful deck. We'll have a quick play coming up with that very soon. It's one of the decks that I ironically have never played on the channel, so wanted to get a little bit of gameplay in with that, even while we're working on the Rakdos Evoke project that I'll kind of reference at the end of this video. Finally, as far as decks that are currently in the top 5, we have Rhinos. Now, Rhinos, it's base teamer. Regardless of whatever flavor gets added to the deck, it's base teamer. You have the 8 Cascade cards, you have the 4 Crashing Footfalls. Has a good to decent scam matchup, has a not so good matchup against Omnath pile, kind of forms this weird triangle at the top of the meta. Beyond that, it depends on what flavoring you want to add to the deck. If you want to add a White Splash for Leyline Binding, potentially Teferi and Arden Plea, as well as some white sideboard cards. One version I know that Doomwake was trying to work on was like a heavy black splash for Shieldred for the Bean matchups. Not sure what approach is best if you just go with good old Teamer and the ability to play Blood Moon, but this is certainly a deck that can still hang with the big boys. It's probably the best beginner-friendly deck in the format anymore. Certainly there are some hate cards you can play against it, Chalice, Roiling Vortex, Void Mirror, etc. But the deck has a fairly decent game plan in a lot of matchups. has a fairly flexible sideboard, gets to play Subtlety and Fury at least, and sometimes Endurance of the Evoke Elementals. So very solid deck overall. As far as the rest of the format, you could place a number of other decks fairly reasonably high. You know, you could play decks like Amulet Titan, Tron. You can place decks like Murktide, Hammer Time, you know, Living End, Coffers. There's a good number of decks that are fairly solid in the format right now, but just don't necessarily have the results to back up that some of these other ones currently have. I would say Living End would probably be the number 6 deck, or you could easily rotate it in the top 5. Would probably bump out Rhinos if it did. But as far as the format currently, it is really about 20 to 25% Rakdos Evoke, and then the rest of the format's like 5 and 6%. As far as why that happened, obviously Evoke's gotten some new tools. It's gotten Orcish Bowmaster. It's, you know, kind of simplified its gameplay and not doing anything fancy. Most of the lists are probably 57 or 58 cards within each other, or so only have like 2 or 3 slots that are a little bit different in the main decks. And, you know, when Murktide took a hit before Preordain was unbanned, you know, a lot of the Murktide players that were kind of top-end grinders kind of gravitated towards Rakdos Evoke because, well, it does give you some player agency. It is a little bit more explosive and you don't have to grind as much. So Rakdos Evoke is certainly a powerful deck and certainly deserves to be among the top decks in the format, but maybe it is potentially a little overplayed and maybe a little overpowered, a la when Jund had Deathrite Shaman back in the day. As far as what we're doing on the channel, I started a joke stream the other night. Let's get Rakdos Scam banned stream. And I'm going to continue doing that for a little while. You know, maybe the deck will stick around for another couple of years, but I really think that Rakdos Scam is on borrowed time. I think something's going to take a hit out of it, whether it be one of the Evoke Elementals, whether it be Voidwalker, Fable. Something's got to take a hit out of that deck to knock it down a peg. Maybe the format will finally adapt and people will actually start playing the decks that beat it more consistently, but kind of hard to say. But that is your top 5, 6-ish decks in the Modern format going into November 2023. As always, if you like Modern content, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Hope to see you for our next video.